appreciate this opportunity to share with you this, some perspectives on what I observe in the world of higher education. And it is not only the point of view of the World Bank. I think it's mostly my own perspectives on the opportunity that I have had over the years of visiting and interacting with people in higher education in more than 70 countries. And by doing that, I think I have developed some capacity to try to see things from a comparative point of view, but also trying to identify most of the time what is the valuable of the different lessons learned in the world of higher education. So let me see if this will work. Here we go. So in order to talk about that, I'd like to ask you, for all of us, to travel a little bit out of the context of higher education. We in higher education have this tendency to be a little bit isolated from the rest of the world, because that's the nature of the tradition of higher education institutions. But there are a variety of issues around higher education that I think it is important to take a look into that, because those, in my opinion, will heavily influence the way that higher education will be shaped in the future years. And of course, we need to go a little bit out of our ivory tower to see some of those issues happening. First of all, I think it is important to recognize that the world has changed. And it has changed much more than we can imagine. Even, if I can report you, for instance, my 50-plus years that I have been around, I can see that there have been some changes just in this period of time in a variety of elements. One of them, of course, is geography. Recently, I visited my parents in my hometown in Ojuelos, in Mexico. And I found that they still have the Mapa Mundi, where I learned about the geography of the world. And I was taking a look to that map, and I realized that there are countries that don't exist anymore, and that there are countries that exist today that when I was a kid didn't exist. So at least from the geographic point of view, it looks like the world has changed. Can we imagine that also there are other elements of our society that are changing? And in which way do we resist sometimes in our higher education institutions in thinking that probably our old traditional model is always the same and it never should change? I think it is time to think about those changes in higher education. So we live in a world which is increasingly interconnected. We can no longer ignore what happens in other parts of the world, but also what we do here cannot be ignored in the rest of the world. And also we live in a world, as you know, which is increasingly intercommunicated. What happens today here, it has immediate effects in other parts of the world, and vice versa. Somebody can be tweeting right now, and many more colleagues may be learning about the tweets immediately after. And of course, the ways that people communicate, connect, and why not teach and learn eventually requires a little bit of additional change. When I was a kid, that was my connection to the world. A radio that my parents had in my hometown that didn't have electricity, because there was no electricity, just batteries. Those are the batteries that we had. This is the equivalent, by the way, to one of those square batteries that you used to put in. And you remember that? Okay. That's the way that I connected to the world. Every day at 7 p.m., my dad turned on the radio to listen to the Carta Blanca news. And that's the way I was connecting to the world. Today, kids do connections to the world in completely different ways. Recently, I was speaking with a group of students, high school students here in Washington, D.C., and I was asking the question, how many of you read the newspaper? And guess what? Only 10 out of about 300 students raised the hand. So, of course, there are different ways that people today learn about what is going on in the world. It is a new reality, we like it or not, and it is a new reality that we better learn to see with different lenses. Otherwise, we might be missing the picture about those major transformations that the world is having, and for which it is legitimate to ask the question, what is the role of higher education? What we are going to be doing? Do we continue doing the same, or is there opportunity to try to be more effective in the future's world? So who told us? We need to think about that kind of from out of the picture, out of the conventional. Who told us, for instance, that the South is in the South and the North is in the North? We have this mental picture of the North up and the South down. But of course, all depends on where we are. Do you agree with me? Look at these pictures of the world, which are a little bit different to the type of world that we imagine constantly. So I used to think that my hometown is the center of the world. This is Ojuelos, by the way, in case you don't know, but this is the capital of the world. But today we will change the capital of the world to Washington. So we are now in the center of the world. And by the way, here is American University, right? So it's, everything is relative. Do you agree with me? And I think in today's world, in this complex world in which we live, we need to think a little bit out of the conventional. So the future is not something that it will happen tomorrow. The future is what we do today or what we don't do today. And that is the sort of the challenge that I try to have when I speak with people about the need to change higher education. When I was a kid, that was a very important source of very scientific information for me, Reader's Digest. And I remember reading one time a quotable quote that said, when I think about the future, I become scared about the present. And that sort of stay there, and still every time that I think about those kind of issues, I said, we need to act now, not tomorrow. So we need to make scenarios, and scenarios might be optimistic, realistic, or pessimistic, but in thinking about the future trends, we need to think about, again, those scenarios. And in order to do that, also, we need to sometimes go back to the past in order to understand the future. So this is me when I was 15 years old. This was me last year. And then, of course, it is impossible to see how I will be, let's say, in the year 2034. But recently, I found an app that allows to extrapolate a little bit of myself to the future. And then I found that not to 34, but to 2040. And this is me in the year 2040. I should tell you that recently I was chatting with my wife, and then she suddenly stopped talking. And then she says, she looked at me like that, and she said, "You remember that picture of yourself in the future?" I said, "Yes." "You look a lot like that." So she says, you better update that picture soon. So anyways, the World Bank, you may know a lot about the World Bank. You may not too much about it. Just 3 years ago, I was, before I joined the bank, I had a little bit of information about this very interesting, exciting, and complex organization. But it is, as you know, the largest development agency in the world. And I didn't come here to talk just about the World Bank, but I just want to position that this organization has a very significant role to play in an official charter, which is working towards eliminating extreme poverty in the world. And some people might say, after 60 years around, it looks like this organization has not been successful, because even today there is still extreme poverty in the world. But I can tell you that, people in the bank are working hard in trying to achieve those goals, which still are very difficult to achieve. Very recently, and we know that the work of this organization is not exempt from controversy. And I have experienced that personally when I'm in countries, just recently, I was last week in Brazil, and I was in a conference in which, basically someone raised the hand and said, guys, you in the World Bank are doing terrible things to the world, and thanks to your policies, the bank is worse than, the world is worse than today. Or when people, for instance, make the point that due to the recommendation of policies that the bank had in the past, particularly in the case of Africa, there has been a significant de-investment in education, and more specifically in higher education. So those are issues that, of course, I take very seriously, because I understand that, again, this work is not exempt from controversy. The president of the World Bank, which, by the way, happens to be a former president of a university, is the first time, I believe, that it is not an economist. I believe that it is also president of the bank. He used to be, by the way, among the ones who were, when he was young, was sort of blaming the World Bank for many things that happened. So anyways, recently at a session that he had in another fine institution here in Washington, D.C., he made a point that we have, for the first time, the opportunity in our time to truly work towards ending extreme poverty within a generation. And of course, a group of economists had made up some of those calculations, and they had come up with sort of the proposition that it is possible, it is doable to reduce and to eliminate extreme poverty in the world. The challenge is not only how to take out people out of extreme poverty, but how to make sure that they don't go back to extreme poverty. How to enable among themselves and the community in which they are the capacity to create the prosperity that will allow them to stay out of poverty. And for that matter, believe it or not, I'm a true believer that education is the best investment that any society can make. History shows that. Numbers show that. I will share with you some of those numbers. I think the challenge is how do we make sure that education reaches the people who need it, but also meaningful and significant education. And again, we might, in higher education, we have the tendency to try to see those things a little bit out of our reach, a little bit of our sense of responsibility. We sometimes are extremely concerned with very legitimate issues in terms of improving quality, being more selective, et cetera, but we tend to forget that if we don't address those problems that are outside of our institutions, sooner or later that's going to be affecting us, so we better act soon. So the question that we faced is if it is possible to eliminate extreme poverty in the world, and in a world which is changing, as I mentioned to you. Let me share with you some numbers. The good news is that fewer people in the world are living in conditions of extreme poverty. This is the good news. The bad news is that still we are talking about a little bit more than 1 billion people in the world who live with less than $1 per day. Just think about that, $1 per day. What you can do with $1 in one day? Nothing, not even take the bus, right? Not even drink, something outside. And still there are a billion people in the world for which $1 is the only possibility for them. So again, more than 1 billion people who remain poor, especially in middle-income economies. And a good number of those are in countries that you guessed, countries that face a challenge in terms of a significant population growth. And the other good news is that a good number of the ones that have been able to get out of extreme poverty, now they see education as a dream that can be afforded. And now they see higher education as a dream that is a right and an opportunity for them. But unfortunately, many times that opportunity doesn't exist. Let me give you one example, the case of my own country, in Mexico. In Mexico, if you are poor, a very small number of people in that cohort will have the opportunity to education. If you are rich, for the quintile of the richest people in the country, basically it is equivalent to South Korea, which is the largest attainment higher education country in the world. But if you are poor, you have the equivalent of attainment access to higher education to Malawi. So you have in Mexico, let's see, Malawi and South Korea at the same time. So there is a big problem in terms of equality of opportunities. And people who have exactly the same right. I think about my own generation. When I was a student in elementary school in my hometown in Ojuelos, out of our generation, only about 5 of us in a group of about 50 had the opportunity to continue studies. And when I go back and travel and I see my friends, my paisanos in my hometown, and I see, the guy who, is the post office individual, the one who works in the selling products in the street, and they were my classmates, and I think, they had exactly the same right that I had. But for whatever reason, they didn't have the same opportunity to have a better life, and that's what we should try to do. So the question is it possible to eliminate extreme poverty in the world? Living on a sustainable world, because that's the other complication we have. The other complication is that we really had hammered our planet, and that is a big challenge. Some of you may remember the work, The Limits to Growth, that book that was published in 1972. And recently I found in a magazine this interesting chart in which basically they were comparing the initial prediction of how the world eventually will face a ecological crisis, if nothing will change, in the year 2030, by the way. And what they did is that they compared the initial predictions with the real data. And as you can see, the real data is not too far from what it was anticipated back in 1972 that it will be a potential problem. So anyways, we have that additional challenge of eliminating extreme poverty in the world, but also in a sustainable world. And just think about that, because sometimes we lose the dimension of the impact of what we do in our day-to-day life in the planet in which we live. And sorry for this, because it is in Spanish, so you have an opportunity to practice your Spanish. So it says here, if Earth, it was formed in midnight, and it has been 24 hours in the history of Earth, right? So let's assume that the history of Earth is 24 hours. And we are right now in the 24 hours, the end of the first cycle of the 24 hours. So the question is, how long human species has been in the history of Earth? Do you have any idea? Out of the 24 hours? Guess how? 1 second. We have been only 1 second. And in this 1 second, we truly have hammered the planet, especially in the last 50 years, believe it or not. And, in 50 years, as you know, the population of the world has doubled. Consumption of seed products has increased 4 times, water 3 times, energy 4 times, and also with huge inequality. You might have countries in which the average consumption of water is quite high, while in others, water is the most difficult resource to reach. So the question is, if we have to prepare our students with a better understanding of a world that is going to be probably a little bit different to the naive world that we talk about, they should be aware of this, and they should become conscious social agents of the world that needs to be changed. So the question again is it possible to reduce extreme poverty in the world in a sustainable world, but also while enabling the sharing of prosperity? And that's where higher education becomes a significant player, because the economic and social returns that higher education has for individuals demonstrate that once you have access to higher education, you become a true economic and social agent. But we need to increase that possibility. That's part of the big challenge. Well, just some of the disparities when we talk about inequality in the world. In terms of income, there are countries in which, again, a year of salary is equivalent to three days of salary in the other country. So that explains, among other things, issues that we are observing today on the newspapers when we see a phenomena such as migration, which is a phenomena that is going to be coming up more and more in the future years, we like it or not. So again, the challenge that the bank has posed to the international community is fostering income growth of the bottom 40% of the population in every country. And again, we believe that that is an achievable dream, that is a possibility for which all of us, including higher education, have to work on. So let me share with you some facts on extreme poverty. The number of extremely poor people has declined, as I mentioned before, by more than 721 million in just this period of time, just 20 years. That's a good news. But we know some facts now. For instance, that most of the poor people live in rural areas and work in agriculture. So what implications has this? On the opposite side, most of the people now are living in cities. Right now, about nearby 65% of the people in the world live in cities. And this will continue growing. It is expected by the year 2050 that about 75% of the population in the world will live in cities. So that means that 25% of people who don't live in the cities are the most vulnerable component of our societies. We know that children are more likely to be extremely poor than others. That's another element we know. So this is the most vulnerable component of our society, is among children. And that's where also there is the greater possibility to impact their lives through education. Poverty rate among children exceeds about 50% in low-income countries. Just think about that. Out of 10 kids, 5 being poor or extreme poor. Isn't that a big challenge? And I think, again, it's something to think about. Poor women also have lower schooling than poor men. And we know that there are plenty of studies showing also the importance that education has for women. And the poor continue to lack in access to basic services. That's another element. And believe it or not, poor are not only in those remote countries that you may think about. Poor are even here. Recently, a friend of mine from Mexico visited me at the World Bank. And when you go to the World Bank, I don't know if you have seen that, there are a good number of homeless living in front of the World Bank and IMF. So she took a picture of one of them, and she wrote on her Twitter, the bank cannot resolve the problem even of the poor people that are living in front of the bank. What is going to happen with the rest of the world? She was cynical about this, but I think she was making a very good point about the fact that poor people are not very far, but even closer to home. And you may know that here in the United States, for instance, about 20% of American children and 13% of all Americans live in conditions of poverty, and a good number of them in conditions of extreme poverty. So it is not only a problem of others, it is also, if you want, our problem here at home. So in an economy which is increasingly global, highly competitive, technologically driven, changing constantly, and more an economy that is knowledge-based, knowledge becomes the key coin for changing lives of individuals. And knowledge is what we do in higher education. And that's where I believe we have a significant importance. Because again, it is an economy which is very nice on one way, but on the other side, with persistent inequalities. And those are just distant and different realities. But again, I think we need to make aware our students about that world in which they will live. Otherwise, we are going to be disservicing their education that we are providing to them if we don't make them aware of the fact that those distant realities are very different and that sometimes are precisely not very distant. Look at these two pictures. This is a favela in Brazil. This is a nice, top-level neighborhood in Brazil. And believe it or not, the only thing that separates them is just a wall. And in the increasingly interconnected world in which we live, as Dominique Moissy said on his very interesting book on geopolitics of emotions, he says, the problem of today is that the poor know how the rich live and vice versa. And as a result, it has become increasingly difficult for rich people to ignore the world's poor. And we can see that on the evening news. So what is the role of higher education? Do we have something to do with that? Or is it just a problem of others? We can continue teaching no matter what, and students can continue learning no matter what. I think we have a significant role to play. And again, we need to go a little bit about some of those factors that have to do directly with higher education. Just let me tell you briefly about the demographic factor. OECD does every 2 years an analysis of the major trends that will impact education. And basically, in the most recent publication, they said, new dynamics of globalization, a new geopolitical game, and we see that every single day on the news. New social challenges, the changing world of the work. We don't conceive anymore working in a traditional way that it used to be. And of course, a significant transformation of the childhood and families, and of course, the role that technology play and will play in the future of our lives. So let me make to you, let's make a geography test. We are at the university, right? So where are those countries located at? Well, here we go. Oh my God, now we are in trouble, right? Well, sometimes we don't even know exactly where they are. That happens to me, believe it or not. Sometimes I have I'm asked to go in a mission to X country, and I said, okay, wait a minute, let me go there and look at the map because I don't know exactly where it is. Of course, I don't know too much about what they speak, what they talk about, what religion they have, what is the demographics of that country. I have no idea. So I experienced that problem in my life, and again, probably you are experiencing some of that now that I'm asking you to identify those countries in the map. Why I'm asking you this question? Well, look at this a list of the world's most populated countries in the world. The year 2000, and again, you have the usual suspects, right? But by the year 2050, which is not far from now, we are talking about 35 years from now only, in addition to the usual suspects, those will be the most populated countries in the world. And if we don't even know where they are located, I think we have a little bit of a problem. And if our students don't know about it, I think we have a little bit of a problem. So by the year 2050, as you know, population will grow where there are more limited resources. And population will shrink where there are a lot of resources, including, of course, the United States. Look at the case of Italy. I took this picture in Rimini, in Italy, last summer. What do you see there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 retired people and just one kid. The sales of diapers in Italy right now for adults are larger than the sales of diapers for kids. And believe it or not, that's happening in Italy, Albania, Armenia, Spain. I was there in Spain last weekend. Big problem. Even here in Puerto Rico, they are having to close schools. Japan is a big issue too. So that issue will affect higher education, believe it or not. Look at the case of Japan, the year 2050, in which, look at the number of people, more than 70, that will be older or very young. In other words, won't work. Just a very small percentage of the population will be in the economic active population, maintaining the rest of the economy. So what you see in this scenario is happening in a good number and will be happening in a good number of developed countries. So of course that will have significant implications for higher education. This is the demographic chart of the United States, and you don't see such an acute element as you may see in other countries. Why? Believe it or not, because the migration factor here. If you take away the migration from the United States population demographics, the economy of the United States will have a very similar chart, the demographics, I'm sorry, as the one that Japan is having right now. So when I used to take my kids to the doctor in Tucson, Arizona, I remember that she had the pediatrician this picture, and I took a picture. I remember every time I took my kids, they were saying, "Hey, Dad, look at that." You better be kind with us. But I think if we better be kind with this generation, because believe it or not, they are going to be paying the pensions once we retire. So they better have good salaries, good jobs, and of course, higher income, because we need at least for them to pay our pensions, if no more. So as I mentioned to you, by the year 2050, the majority of the population will live in cities, and mostly, of course, they will live precisely in the developing world. So in other words, the world with growth in the developing world, sorry for the redundancy, and higher education, believe it or not, will happen mostly there, not here. So there is going to be a significant transition and shift in the way that higher education will have to be facing those realities, we like it or not. So those are pictures not of a science fiction movie, but those are pictures of today's world. And the question is if this is sustainable in the long run, and again, what is the role of higher education? I have no answers, believe it or not. I'm just posing the questions to you, because I think the reality is so complex just for easy solutions. So by the way, this is a picture of a public pool in Shanghai. So the other reality is that we live also in a society which is increasingly mobile. And there will be, we like it or not, increased migration towards the developed world in the years to come. And there are many reasons for that. One of them, significant one, of course, is economic. Just think about between Mexico and the US. Just put yourselves in a situation in which you are asked that, or you are being informed that as of tomorrow, your salary will be reduced 90%. So you will have to live just with 10% of your salary. Are you going to be happy for that? Can you survive with that? Let me pose the question exactly the opposite. Let's assume that tomorrow you are being told that there is a place nearby here in which you can make 9 times what you are making on a daily basis. Are you willing to take the risk for a better life? Probably, right? And that is a reality of the economy of the region. And again, what we are seeing right now in Europe, in terms of the movement of people from North Africa as well as from Syria, it has to do with that reality of this completely different worlds which are one in front of the other, for which there is a legitimate aspiration and dream of people of having a better life. And as we see that some societies are becoming older, there is going to be an increased need that they will have of people which are younger to do the work. And we are seeing that right now in some of the policies in the countries, very close to here, in the case of Canada. As you know, recently has been a major shift in the migration policy in such a way that if you are, for instance, a university student in Canada, and you want to stay there, you will have a residence card immediately after, and after 3 or 4 years, I believe, you can become citizens of Canada. So some countries are adopting very aggressive policies in preparation of what it is going to be coming in terms of the shift of the population. And I think it is important to keep in mind that. So one side of the world becoming older, in contrast, other part of the world extremely young. Look at the case of the MENA region, the Middle East and Northern Africa region, where nearly a half of the population is under 20 years old. Think about that. 50% of the population younger than 20 years. 50% of the population for which education, believe it or not, may become a big differentiator in a society which is extremely fragile, not only for the region, but now, as we can see with ISIS, for the rest of the world. So what we see here, those pictures that you have seen recently in the newspapers, I think it is going to be a reality in a world which is going to be increasingly mobile, in which will be, both the skilled, the low-skilled, but also the ones which want to have skills. So I anticipate by the year 2025, that's where we will see much more than increased brutal, I might say, pressure for talent in the world. The last item has to do with the fact that we live in a world which is increasingly diverse. And the diversity of the world, it's something to highlight, to positively celebrate. And of course, it creates significant challenges. If we think about the fact that there are just a small number of countries to contain people with completely different perspectives and trying to find ways in which that interaction happens in a positive way. And of course, the lack of education, we know that well. The lack of higher education leads to increased stereotypes about each other's. Different studies that we have done show that very clearly. The most intolerant people are the ones who have limited levels of education. And the more you have education, the more possible is that you will be more tolerant. But I think we need to recognize that because, again, education and higher education has a very positive and significant role to play in reducing those stereotypes about each other and in reducing this sometimes perceived ignorance that we might have about the rest of the world, as you can see on this chart in which I've been labeled as coming from the country of tequila. And by the way, we don't drink tequila in Mexico. This is not tequila, it's just water. By the formula to drink tequila, you may know is that the first is with water, the second without water, and the third one is like water. So I'm getting close to that. And again, English is being seen as the lingua franca of the business and the academia. And sometimes in the US, we have kind of a lazy attitude about that because we keep saying that, oh yeah, it would be good to learn a second language. And but look at just the numbers for the today and for the future. Certainly, English is very important, but there are other languages that are going to be increasingly important in the future years. And I think that's why it is important to keep that in mind because. Okay, so. I almost finished. I have another 300 slides, and that's. So in summary, I think demographics is and will continue being a major driver for growth in higher education in the world. And higher education will continue experiencing tremendous growth and both growth and diversification. So that's why the role that a extended university does here is very important, because it is precisely pushing for innovation in ways to teach, to deliver, and to learn. And I think that is something that more and more institutions of higher education have to be thinking about. Soon, the developing countries will have the greatest share of the worldwide higher education enrollment. It will be shrinking in the developed world. The growth will happen not here, in other parts of the world. Secondly, it is in those economies where the future profile of global higher education is going to be defined. We like it or not. That's where it's going to be defined. It's going to be better or worse or just different. But it's going to be there where it's going to be defined, that future profile. And worldwide, I anticipate that higher education will transition from a very elitist still approach towards a much more flexible access model, for which, again, what extended university does is significant important. So if we take in consideration some of these elements, a funding model for higher education, which is being being challenged, the role of technology, the fact that there are more and more multinational universities, and also an increased portability of credentials, as I was talking about the movement of people, I think it is important to recognize that all of us will challenge the traditional assumption of what do we mean by higher education institutions, and by universities. And I think that's a question for all of us to still sort of question and also to try to figure out. There will be increased pressure for access to higher education, but believe it or not, not for many years, because even those countries that will continue being the largest ones in the world, all of them, with the exception of India, are experiencing also declines in the population. So there is going to be also, a plateau effect in that. Last element, technology. Technology changes and will change a lot our lives. Again, if we think about the future, we need to think a little bit about the past. Think about 1968, where you were in 1968. Well, a good number of you probably were not warned, but some of you still, were around. It took 74 years for a home, for 50 million homes in the world to have a telephone, and only 4 years to have access to the internet. There was my Aunt Consuelo in my hometown. She was the switchboard person. And that's the way the telephones work. And by the way, she knew everything about everybody. My dad told me one day the story that she was reading a dictionary. And then, he said to her, "Oh, now you're learning English." And then she said, no. What happens is that I'm very frustrated when, the people from Ojuelos living abroad call home and I don't understand what they are talking about. I want to hear what they are talking about. So anyways, that's the way communications happened when I was a kid. And of course, today is completely different. How many of you remember what the slide rule is? So let me ask the question to probably you. You know what a slide rule is? No idea, right? What about you? No idea, right? Oh, you know. Good. Excellent. You know what is a slide rule, right? Yeah. Because when we talk to students today and we ask this question and they say, I have no idea, they say, this is where our calculators. That's the way we make calculations. So this is the technology we have as students. If we don't think that technology will change in the future generation as it is today, we are totally wrong. So technology for sure change it. For instance, in the industry of music, it will change in higher education. Believe it or not, by the year, look at this. We are going back to the past. No, anyways, but the technology that we have today, of course, has changed our lives and, of course, are very marvelous and interesting. People even communicate in different ways today. And, of course, there has been an increased access to technology. Just this number is very evident. 20 homes have all the traffic of internet that the world had years ago, but still there are significant disparities in access to technology and access to interconnectivity. But again, those are things that are very important because the world will change. When we were kids, we saw this on the magazines about the novel technology. I can assure you that the future generations will see our modern tools today also as an ancient element, and certainly. So the question is, what is the impact that technology will have in higher education? I think it has a significant impact, and it will have much more than what we can imagine. So it's an evident connection between education, economic development, and social development, and reducing poverty is precisely enabling more people to have access to higher education. Unfortunately, again, education is not always at an easy reach. And those are just a few pictures that show how difficult it is even for people to have just access to the basic opportunities of education. Look at the case, for instance, of Africa, where out-of-school children are this number, and then students in higher education is just this number, only 3%. Think about that, only 3 out of 100 who have the opportunity of higher education. And interestingly, as a majority of countries in a continent such as Africa are having universal access or working towards universal access in elementary education, then what is next? Once education at elementary level is there, then people legitimately are looking for opportunities beyond. And that's why there will be a significant pressure on higher education for the future years. The studies that the World Bank conduct show that very clearly. Education is the major, and access to knowledge is the major differentiator between poverty and between greater access. Look at this chart showing precisely in a country such as Ghana or South Korea, the difference that represents that. And also the studies that the World Bank does show that the average rate of return to years of schooling is about 10%. One extra year of education you have in your life, about 10% extra revenues that you will make in your life. But look at the information about tertiary education. Tertiary education is where the largest returns of investment happens for individuals. So that's where the best investment happens, provided that, of course, people has basic education and secondary education. But that's where the highest return of economic return happen, with the exception of the MENA countries, I believe. All of them had the highest returns of economic returns precisely at the higher education level. In summary, investing in tertiary education may accelerate technological diffusion, which will decrease knowledge gaps and can help to reduce poverty in the world. But also we know that higher education is not just about economics, it's about the social returns. And again, those are just some examples of the different studies that have been conducted showing that higher education is also a principal factor of social mobility, and also that more education leads to people more environmentally conscious, tolerant, healthier, and of course more aware of their rights as citizens in the societies in which we live. So it is the best investment. The question is, what type of education? And I know that I'm running out of time, so I will have to skip some of this, otherwise I will never finish. But let me go just to the last ones that I like to use to finish my presentation. If I find them, of course. Sorry, because I had some very funny there that I will have to skip. So we need to look at new ways to think about higher education. And I think, first of all, there is enough room for higher education to become more flexible, more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and also, of course, less risk-averse and more internationally aware, but more locally connected. And I just think about the role of an institution such as American University. You know, American University does a very good job. I have a high respect for this institution, for not only for the good quality of what the teaching and the research component, but also because the type of students that graduate from this institution. But we cannot be satisfied with that and say, okay, we are wonderful, that's excellent. Nothing happens. I think there is enough room to do more as an institution, as faculty members, as students, in order to create conditions for this type of institution. So do we have room to become more flexible? For sure. I can assure you that there is enough opportunities to become more flexible as an institution, to become, of course, more internationally connected, and of course, more locally connected just to the community that is closer to here. And also that means, for instance, flexibility in the way that we teach. You know, think about these professions that you'll find there. Believe it or not, All of those are not professions of the past or the future. All of those are professions of the present. And many times in our institutions, we keep thinking that people should study just the traditional academic programs because that's what it has happened all the time. But I think becoming more flexible is an opportunity that we have to work on. We need to prepare students, of course, with very good technical skills, but also with more capacity to work in teams, with more capacity to adapt to those changing multicultural environments that will happen and will exist for them. Students that need to be much more global aware, but of course, much more conscious of the local responsibility they have as citizens in the places where they live. Students who speak at least a second language, if no more. Students who are able to use adequately technology to better communicate, and more important, believe it or not, students who have acquired the curiosity to continue learning for the rest of their life. Because in the best scenario, students graduating from this university will be the best of the world, as you know, but a day after they graduate, as you know very well, a good chunk of what they studied, probably they won't use it anymore, as it happens in your respective lives. Think about that. How many of you, the ones who already are professionals, work today in something different to what you were studied for? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look at here in this group, which is usually the group that has the lowest rate of changing professions. If you go outside and you ask the same question, a great majority of people will say, yes, I studied something completely different to what I'm doing today. So this is not new, but it is highly exacerbated in the increasingly changing dynamic world in which we live. And higher education has significant role to play and significant room for improvement. Those who criticize higher education talk about some of these issues as very common. Arthur Levine, which I understand that will come here next month, he wrote this, which I love this quote from him, when he was making the analogy of the crisis on higher education to the sinking of the Titanic. So he said, sometimes higher education looks like it is taking a look to priorities a little bit different to what the reality of the world is. He says, you know, the captain says that the first priority is to save the crew. Think about higher education. Who's the crew? Next is to avoid the problems. We cannot shoot down the university, right? We have to continue teaching. The third one is to repair the ship. So let's create a commission to study the problems and to see what solutions they come up with. And then the last priority, oh my God, the students, okay, goodbye, good luck. Let's see what happens with the next generation. The ones criticizing higher education said that the Italian university of 1350 was like this, which, by the way, somebody was sleeping here, as you can see. And that the universities of today are more or less the same. Probably it changed the way that we use technology and our clothing, but still we are repeating the same traditional model of the ones who knows, the teacher, the ones who don't know, which are the students. And this is this model which has proven to be very useful, but of course, it probably needs to be a little bit of a challenge. And then that we are in higher education a little bit good at blaming others for the problems we have, right? There is not one single higher education institution with which I interact in which they complain that the students that are arriving are terribly prepared, that higher schools are doing a terrible job. And then you go to a high school and they blame universities for not preparing good teachers, by the way, and also the previous levels of education, because I don't know what is happening with secondary school, and you can continue in this blaming process. So I think we need to make sure that our students are prepared with good skills, but also with very sound humanistic preparation, more general education, and also more work in their attitudes in addition to the aptitudes they have. And of course, internationalizing those institutions, such as American University, is something that needs to be done very seriously. Fanta always here. She can tell you wonderful things about what she's doing through NAFSA. But I think it is part of this idea of recognizing that those priorities are not for tomorrow. Those are priorities that we needed to address in the past. Eliminating extreme poverty is also the same. I think for a number of people it's been seen as a good idea, but, you know, we have many more things to do. It's too far from home. Who cares about the problems in Africa We have other problems here. It's too far from higher education. We are here just teaching kids. This problem is something to be resolved by governments or by rich people. We don't have money. What do we do? And also it's a priority that I hope tomorrow the United Nations will take care of. It is a priority that we as society have to take care of. And the art of ambiguity in higher education, in which we are very good, is to continue doing the same thing, although waiting for different results. And of course, there is significant room for collaboration. And there are different ways to collaborate, as you can see, or even this one. Believe it or not, somebody told me one day that this penguin was teaching the other penguin how to swim. So it was collaborating with him. So, and of course, even a small contribution can make a big difference, believe it or not. Of course, there are no easy solutions, and there are no simple formulas what it may work here in your classroom, in your university, in your personal case as a student or as a family member, might not work in other cases. And the future, believe it or not, is not something you guess with a crystal ball, or it's not something you extrapolate. It's something you build. So my invitation today to finish is to make sure that you think about ways in which you personally, as a faculty member, student, as a member of the society, can make a difference in making sure that the dream of a better life is also achievable for others. Paul Valéry said years ago that the trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be. The future is no longer what it used to be. Thank you very much for your patience. I truly appreciate your